Homeland Security Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security will come to order. Without objection, the chair may declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Today's hearing will examine threats to U.S. ports infrastructure, particularly concerning ship-to-shore cranes. Without objection, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Ezel, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez, are permitted to sit with the subcommittee and ask questions of the witnesses. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we're here to discuss a matter of national urgency that strikes at the very heart of our nation's economic vitality and security, the integrity of our maritime infrastructure. This includes port equipment, such as ship-to-shore cranes and other operational technology in widespread use at American ports, and it's manufactured or installed in the People's Republic of China. The proliferation of port equipment and operational technology manufactured or installed by PRC engineers at our nation's ports introduces significant supply chain vulnerabilities into our maritime transportation system. As a country, we must acknowledge and assess these risks, threats, and vulnerabilities, and decide how to effectively respond. When I was mayor of Miami-Dade County, I witnessed firsthand the critical role that ports play in our local, national, and global economy. Our ports are not just hubs of commerce, they are gateways to the world. However, our ports are increasingly vulnerable given the evolving threat landscape. We must address this issue with the utmost seriousness. Last week, the Biden administration signed an executive order providing the U.S. Coast Guard with new authorities to respond to potential malicious actors targeting our maritime sector, and particularly those from the PRC. I commend the administration in this initial action, but I know that more must be done. The ship-to-shore cranes towering over our docks, while instrumental to our port operations, have become a focal point of concern. Most of these cranes are made by CPMC, a PRC state-owned enterprise under the direct control of the CCP. I have witnessed firsthand the destructive power of communist regimes and have no interest in allowing the CCP to conduct industrial and economic espionage in our ports through their cranes. Last March, Chairman Gallagher of the Select Committee on the CCP and I visited Port Miami to speak directly with port operators and to highlight the legislative efforts we are undertaking to safeguard our ports. This Congress, I introduced the Port Crane Security and Inspection Act. This piece of legislation is a testament to our commitment to ensuring that the backbone of our maritime infrastructure is not compromised. In addition, I have led an ongoing joint investigation with the Select Committee on the CCP to deepen our understanding of the risks at hand. We have learned that these ship-to-shore cranes, which are essential to our maritime operations, could potentially be used as conduits for espionage or as a CCP Trojan horse that threaten to undermine our national security. Findings are clear. Nearly 80%, and I'll repeat that, nearly 80% of the ship-to-shore cranes in our ports in the United States come from CPMC. And this near monopoly not only presents cybersecurity threats, but also supply chain vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who wish to inflict damage to our nation. Monopoly allows for CPMC to compromise U.S.-bound cranes that would cause malfunction or facilitate cyber espionage. Fortunately, Communist China's influence in the supply chain extends beyond the state-owned enterprises like CPMC. Third-party companies often create the internal operational components for these ship-to-shore cranes. These include programmable logic controllers, which control many of the ship-to-shore crane systems, as well as crane drives and motors. In most cases, CPMC requires that these companies ship their components to the PRC, where they can be installed by CPMC engineers or technicians. In the context of our ongoing investigation, our committee has explored the role of ABB, a Swiss engineering firm. ABB provides its components directly to CPMC engineers to install on cranes in Communist China. I've requested information from ABB's U.S. country holding officer about the company's supply chain security practices, as well as other companies with ties to the CCP. Better understanding their practices gives us a broader picture of how their components may be compromised. I was discouraged that ABB had not been as forthcoming as they should have been, particularly when it involves U.S. national security. Resolving these concerns is crucial for ensuring the security and integrity of the United States maritime infrastructure and protecting against the risks associated with foreign influence and control over critical supply chains. We cannot stand idly by while components of American maritime infrastructure could be weaponized against us. It is not just about commerce, it's also about national security, about protecting the very fabric of our society from those who seek to unravel it. Going forward, we must take decisive action to secure our ports, to invest in domestic manufacturing of port infrastructure, and to ensure that every ship-to-shore crane, every bolt, every piece of equipment that operates within our borders is safe, secure, and serves the interests of the United States. With that, I yield back, and now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Thanador, for his opening statement.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Chairman Jimenez, for your kindness in accommodating my lateness here. And I also thank you for calling today's important and timely hearing. Thank you also to our panel of witnesses for sharing your expertise today. The security of our nation's seaports is vital to the success of our economy. Seaports move more than 99% of the cargo coming to the U.S. from overseas. They support more than 31 million American jobs and generate 5.4 trillion in total economic value, representing more than a quarter of nation's economy. The daily life of Americans everywhere depends upon the ability of government experts, port owners, operators, and their partners in stakeholders to protect ports and rest of the marine transportation system from both physical and cyber attacks. As ports have become increasingly networked and reliant on computer systems, the importance of instituting strong cybersecurity protections has arisen dramatically. We have already seen the devastating impacts of cyber attacks on ports can have. Cyber attacks on ports in the US and overseas have brought the transport of cargo to a standstill and cost hundreds of millions of dollars in economic damage. Thankfully, the Biden administration is taking decisive actions. Just last week, the administration announced a series of actions that will greatly enhance the cybersecurity of our nation's ports. Last Wednesday, President Biden signed an executive order to provide the Coast Guard the express authority to address threats to cybersecurity and mitigate vulnerabilities. The executive order also requires maritime industry partners to report cyber incidents and threats to government agencies. In addition, the Coast Guard issued proposed regulations to establish minimum cybersecurity requirements at U.S. seaports, covering a wide range of proven security measures to strengthen our cyber defenses. Finally, the Coast Guard has issued a security directive to address vulnerabilities posed by Chinese manufactured cranes, and President Biden announced an investment of more than $20 billion to improve port infrastructure and initiate domestic manufacturing of cranes. Taken together, these actions represent the single largest advancement in port cybersecurity in history. These actions are just the latest in Biden administration's comprehensive approach to addressing long-standing cybersecurity threats to critical infrastructure. Following Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, the administration committed to raising the cybersecurity baseline and across all critical infrastructure sectors, including by using existing authorities to set baseline cybersecurity standards. At President Biden's direction, the Department of Homeland Security initiated a series of cybersecurity sprints which encourage key owners of operators in certain sectors to make security investments in partnership with the federal government. These sprints leverage DHS resources and enhance cybersecurity across a wide range of critical areas. To date, these sprints have covered ransomware, the cybersecurity workforce, industrial control systems, transportation, and election security. In addition, the Transportation Security Administration has issued a series of important new security requirements addressing cybersecurity across a range of transportation modes, from pipelines to mass transit, rail to aviation. Last November, the Biden administration announced the creation of supply chain resilience centers within DHS, which will help coordinate and advance efforts to secure chains from disruptions. In addition to its sector-by-sector assessment of cybersecurity risks, the Biden administration has taken seriously the growing threat posed by our most sophisticated adversaries. Notably, in April 2023, Secretary Merkes directed DHS to undertake a 90-day People's Republic of China threat sprint, which evaluated, among other things, security threats the People's Republic of China poses to U.S. supply chains. The administration is taking bold actions to address cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities, not just for cranes and ports, but across all sectors of critical infrastructure. Now it is time for Congress to do our part. We sit here today on the verge of a potential government shutdown yet again, because House Republicans have placed extreme political demands above their responsibility to govern. I'm hopeful the plan announced by congressional leaders yesterday will help keep the government open. A government shutdown would be devastating to the Coast Guard's operation, including its efforts to implement cybersecurity enhancement. I look forward to hearing more about these critical efforts from our witnesses. And Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. And now other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Again, I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this critical topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Rear Admiral Derek Trinque serves as Director for Strategic Plans, Policy, and Logistics for U.S. Transportation Command. Rear Admiral Wayne Arguin serves as the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy for the U.S. Coast Guard. Rear Admiral John Vann serves as the Commander for the U.S. Coast Guard Cyber Command. And Ms. Christina Brzozowski serves as the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Trade Economic Security Office of Strategic Policy and Plans for the Department of Homeland Security. And I challenge you to do that in one breath. I thank each of our distinguished witnesses for being here today, and I recognize Rear Admiral Trinque for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to be here with my colleagues from the United States Coast Guard and Department of Homeland Security to discuss U.S. Transportation Command's key role with strategic seaports. U.S. TRANSCOM is a functional warfighting combatant command, including 3 component commands: the Air Force's Air Mobility Command, the Navy's Military Sealift Command, and the Army's Surface Deployment and Distribution Command. Together, we provide support to the 10 other U.S. combatant commands, the military services, defense agencies, and other government organizations. We are an agile and resilient logistics enterprise which conducts globally integrated mobility operations, leads the broader joint deployment and distribution enterprise, and provides enabling capabilities to project and sustain the joint force in support of national objectives. With the changing strategic and operational landscape, our logistics and mobility enterprise will play an increasingly critical role in achieving our national defense objectives. On any given day, U.S. TRANSCOM is conducting more than 400 airlift missions, more than 40 air refueling missions, and transporting 10 patients through air evacuation. We have an aircraft taking off and landing every 2 to 3 minutes, over 200 rail cars en route, 30 ships underway, 1,500 freight shipments en route, 20 defense couriers en route, and 1,200 personal vehicle and property shipments en route. To remain successful, U.S. TRANSCOM must be ready to project power today and tomorrow, and we will only achieve this through our partnerships with commercial industry. Our competitors watch our every move and quickly digest lessons to improve their ability to disrupt, degrade, or deny our capabilities. We synchronize our operations, activities, and investments to balance the enterprise's attention on today's requirements while preparing to meet those of tomorrow. To maximize our role across the spectrum of competition and conflict, we align our campaigning objectives across the primary elements of our warfighting strategy. Strategic seaports are vital nodes in the nation's transportation network and play a critical role in the Department of Defense's ability to deploy forces and equipment worldwide. Only 18 of all U.S. commercial seaports are officially designated DoD strategic seaports. These strategic seaports are particularly critical to U.S. TRANSCOM's ability to project military power. U.S. TRANSCOM oversees and directs strategic transportation operations executed by Military Sea Lift Command and Military Surface Deployment and Distribution Command. In this role and under DoD guidance, U.S. TRANSCOM, in coordination with port security stakeholders, will conduct, arrange, and/or augment other agencies' port assessment activities to identify and remediate vulnerabilities to infrastructure critical to strategic deployment and sustainment missions. In direct coordination with applicable U.S. Coast Guard captains of the port, the results of these assessments are shared with appropriate port security stakeholders while protecting controlled, unclassified information. The Ports for National Defense program provides the engineering and analytic foundation for the DoD Strategic Seaport Program. We work with our partners in the National Ports Readiness Network, including Surface Deployment Distribution Command, Military Sea Lift Command, U.S. Northern Command, U.S. Army Forces Command, the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Transportation Security Agency, and the Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration, who also serves as the chair for the NPRM, to establish formal coordination and cooperation with the commercial seaports most important to DoD. U.S. TRANSCOM is the Department of Defense's single port manager and maintains agreements with each of these commercial ports to support timely access to the facilities needed to conduct a large-scale rapid deployment. Each port, alongside the Maritime Administration, generates and maintains a port readiness plan. This plan identifies the specific port facilities that would be made available to DoD at time of need. Strategic seaports voluntarily participate in the program. We're grateful for seaport participation as a vital aspect of U.S. TRANSCOM's ability to project power in support of our nation. Again, I thank you for the invitation to be witness at this hearing, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Rear Admiral Trinque, and I recognize Rear Admiral Arguin for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tenedar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be here today to discuss the United States Coast Guard's efforts to protect the marine transportation system. I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Our national security and economic prosperity are inextricably linked to a safe and efficient marine transportation system, or MTS. The vast system of ports and waterways that make up the MTS supports $5.4 trillion of annual economic activity, accounts for the employment of more than 30 million Americans, and enables critical sea lift capabilities, allowing our armed forces to project power around the globe. The connectedness and increasing complexity of the MTS brings new vulnerabilities and threats, including the cyber domain. In response to dynamic threats, the United States Coast Guard has taken decisive action in our maritime critical infrastructure to harden and build resilience against cyber attacks. Just last week, the President signed an executive order which further enables our port security efforts by explicitly addressing cyber threats. It empowers the Coast Guard to prescribe conditions and restrictions for the safety of waterfront facilities and vessels in port, and includes reporting requirements for actual and threatened cyber incidents. With this authority, the Coast Guard issued a directive requiring specific risk management actions for all owners and operators of cranes manufactured by the People's Republic of China. While the specific requirements are deemed sensitive security information and cannot be shared publicly, our captains of the port around the country are working directly with crane owners to ensure compliance. Last week, the Coast Guard also released a proposed rulemaking to set baseline cybersecurity requirements for vessels, facilities, and outer continental shelf facilities. The service stresses the need for public participation in the proposed rulemaking. The diversity of the maritime industry and the dynamic nature of the cyber threat make public comment critical. While the Coast Guard is focused on implementing the major efforts initiated last week, work is far from done. The MTS is indeed a system where an attack on one segment has a potential to affect others. This demands collaboration across government and industry to ensure that a unified and coordinated response to cyber challenges in the maritime domain. Like all other risks to the MTS, cyber risk is a shared responsibility. As such, the Coast Guard will continue its work across all levels of government and engage with industry to assess security vulnerabilities, determine risk, and deploy mitigation strategies. This layered approach, from the local to international level, is critical due to the size, diversity, and interconnectedness of the MTS. As the proven prevention and response framework is applied to prevent and minimize disruptions to the MTS in ports around the country, I'm grateful for the support of this committee to ensure the Coast Guard has the authorities and the resources needed to stay ahead. I look forward to your questions on the vital work the Coast Guard does every day to safeguard America's ports. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and for your continued support of the United States Coast Guard.
Thank you, Rear Admiral Arguin. I now recognize Rear Admiral Vann for 5 minutes. Summarize his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be here today to discuss the protection, defense, and resiliency of the marine transportation system, the MTS, from today's cyber threats. I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record.
Without objection.
The Coast Guard is committed to addressing cybersecurity risks and responding to cyber incidents in the marine environment to ensure our nation's economic and national security. The size, interdependence, complexity, and criticality of the MTS makes it a prime target for criminals, activists, terrorists, state-sponsored actors, and adversarial nation states. The diversity of potential malicious actors and their increasing levels of sophistication present substantial challenges to stakeholders and government agencies focused on protecting the MTS from these evolving cyber threats. The threat of disruptive cyber effects to our critical infrastructure, specifically to the MTS, require us to be vigilant, proactive, collaborative, and resourceful. Cyber intrusions and attacks, such as ransomware attacks, have a devastating impact on transportation critical infrastructure. A successful cyber attack could impose unrecoverable losses to port operations and electronically stored information, hampering national economic activity and disrupting global supply chains. The increased use of automated systems in shipping, offshore platforms, and port and cargo facilities creates enormous efficiencies and introduces additional attack vectors for malicious cyber actors. This growing reliance on cyber physical systems and operational technologies requires a comprehensive approach by all stakeholders to manage cyber risks and ensure safety and security of the MTS. With the support of Congress, the Coast Guard has invested in growing and maturing Coast Guard Cyber Command to assess, identify, and respond to cyber risks and threats. CG Cyber currently has 2 cyber protection teams, or CPTs, with a 3rd CPT expected to reach full operational capability later this summer. Using Coast Guard authorities, the CPTs partner with local captains of the port and industry to address cybersecurity risks in the MTS. In fact, a Coast Guard CPT was the first federal cyber response team in 2021 to identify probable port network intrusion by a People's Republic of China actor known as Volt Typhoon. Our ability to share information and critical vulnerabilities with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and law enforcement partners enabled a timely response and rapid mitigation of risks with that port partner. CG Cyber's Maritime Cyber Readiness Branch, subject matter experts in cybersecurity and marine safety, regularly engages with industry to improve cyber literacy and support Coast Guard captains of the port in measuring cyber risk. We will soon release the third annual Cyber Trends and Insights in the Marine Environment Report, which provides key insights into trends to aid industry and other stakeholders to identify and address current and emerging cyber risks. Through consistent work and collaboration with other departments, agencies, and industry, CG Cyber shares critical vulnerability information, mitigation strategies, and threat intelligence. Our CPTs regularly deploy with Department of Defense and CISA teams to provide maritime and operational technology subject matter expertise around the globe. We are better and more resilient because we exercise and execute operations together. I look forward to continuing this conversation and appreciate the opportunity to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rear Admiral Vann. I now recognize Ms. Brzozowski for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statements.
Good morning, Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Homeland Security's role in securing maritime infrastructure and bolstering supply chain resilience. The department is deeply committed to preventing and countering all threats to our national and economic security, including cyber attacks and other disruptions that could impact the efficient movement of goods through our nation's seaports. To advance this mission, DHS has a wide range of expertise and authorities, including protecting cyberspaces, securing critical infrastructure, facilitating lawful trade and travel, and preparing for and responding to disasters. Alongside the U.S. Coast Guard, DHS employees from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Transportation Security Administration, and others work diligently to protect our seaports. They also work to protect the broader maritime transportation system and other critical infrastructures and address and mitigate against all hazards threatening our security. At DHS, we are incredibly vigilant and committed to making maritime ports and other critical infrastructures and supply chains as secure as we can. But we live in a world of constantly evolving threats. We know that adversaries are constantly probing and developing new tactics, and that supply chains are vulnerable to a wide range of shocks and disruptions. That's why DHS operational components are continuously monitoring for new risks, providing key services to the private sector, and ensuring that they also recognize and manage these risks as both core business risks and as fundamental to national and economic security. That's also why we've established a new Supply Chain Resilience Center within the department. The new center serves to coordinate the department's supply chain efforts and work with partners and allies to research and assess potential threats and plan how we can bolster resilience throughout the U.S. supply chain. The DHS Supply Chain Resilience Center supported the development of the executive order on amending regulations relating to the safeguarding of vessels, harbors, ports, and waterfront facilities, and the Coast Guard's related Maritime Security Directive, both announced last week. And we will continue to support the Coast Guard and other DHS operational components as they amplify and execute on these new provisions. Since our launch, the DHS Supply Chain Resilience Center has connected and collaborated across DHS components with the U.S. interagency and with private sector partners from the transportation and trade communities. We have engaged to share our concerns with industry and seek their feedback on potential risks posed by port cranes and other port equipment and systems manufactured by the People's Republic of China. We supported the development of cybersecurity practices and conducted internal tabletop exercises to assess how the department would respond to a disruption from these types of potential threats. And we are also engaging with international partners to learn more about their perceptions of the risk and to share our insights on practical mitigations to further U.S. supply chain resilience. Looking ahead, we'll focus on issue areas where we can bring the full weight of DHS authorities and expertise to bear to counter PRC threats not only today, but into the future. We're committed to effectively employing all appropriate tools to secure these vital supply chains and facilitate the trade that keeps our economy functioning. We'll work very closely within the new cabinet-level Council on Supply Chain Resilience and with our interagency partners, including the Departments of Commerce, Transportation, and Defense, to bring a whole-of-government approach to this vital mission. In addition to the Supply Chain Resilience Center's work, my office is also responsible for representing the Department of Homeland Security in interagency processes to screen foreign direct investment for national security risks, namely the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. We play a leading role in reviewing cases that implicate U.S. critical infrastructure, including our ports, in the broader trade and logistics sectors of which they are a part. Our national security and economic prosperity are inextricably linked to a safe and efficient maritime security system, which of course includes our seaports. Each day, DHS plays a critical role in facilitating the safe and secure flow of millions of tons of cargo shipments into the U.S. market. We know that a port disruption can snarl supply chain and impact the delivery of goods, and that's why the department is committed across our operational components and through the new Supply Chain Resilience Center to exercise the full range of our authorities, partnerships, and expertise to ensure Americans get the goods and materials they need. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brzozowski. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. During my my conversations with the firm ABB, we found out that while they supply many of the motors, drives, etc., software for a crane, the crane built in China is the steel structure, and then the things that operate it and move and all are sometimes manufactured in China, all right, wholly manufactured in China, and sometimes they're manufactured by other companies, some of which are Western companies, ABB being one of them. One of the things that I found most disturbing about that testimony or our conversation was that they relayed to us that ABB actually ships their motors, software, hardware to the PRC, and that by contract, the CPMC gives to them, CPMC engineers will be installing that hardware, software, et cetera, that makes the cranes go. Rear Admiral Vann, is it possible that during that process, the CPMC could be installing malware, ransomware, or Trojan horses in the software that's actually provided by, and the hardware actually provided by, Western companies?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. What we have found in our activities, our operations aboard ZPMC cranes and the networks on the cranes that connect to the cranes and shore side that communicate with the cranes are either by design vulnerabilities of open connections. And again, I say by design because oftentimes the monitoring of the cranes and the maintenance of the systems on board the cranes is done from a hub outside the port or in the port land side infrastructure and then communicated to the crane through a connection. So we have found, I would say, openings, vulnerabilities that are there by design. What we have not found is instances, as you put it, of malware or Trojan horse type software. Our concern is with the vulnerabilities and the operators that operate these cranes being aware that those vulnerabilities exist, and then considering the reporting that we've heard about PRC attempting to get onto critical infrastructure. These are obviously important nodes in our marine transportation system, sir. So haven't found that yet, but those vulnerabilities exist to be able to access what's on the crane.
That's interesting because the ABB folks told me that the crane system is actually like a closed system. It doesn't communicate with the outside world. I found that a little bit strange. Now you're telling me that no, it does communicate. It has to communicate with the outside world. Because I would figure there'd be software updates, right? And then also the crane itself communicating somewhere and saying, "Hey, this is bad over here. You have to replace it." So, are these cranes fully enclosed and protected from the outside world, or do they actually communicate with the outside world?
So what we have found is the cranes are designed to be able to communicate with the outside world. They can be operated disconnected from the outside world, but as you mentioned, sir, oftentimes for maintenance reasons or monitoring, some of our operators will make a connection just for that activity. Others will leave the crane disconnected and have a technician come on site to access that data, and others will operate with the crane connected all the time.
Very good. We also found that there were some modems installed in some cranes. And we were advised, no, it's still a closed system, but then why would you need a modem if it's a closed system? And it came with modems. So I'll leave that, you know, for another day. We can discuss that another day. Another concern that I have is, in the United States, 80% of the cranes that we operate in our port system are built by Communist China. If the Communist Chinese decide to embargo spare parts, what would happen to our port infrastructure? What would happen to our trade if in fact that happened? And how long will it take for, if there is an effect, for that to take hold?
Mr. Chairman, you're referring to spare parts for the cranes in this
Yeah.
case?
So maybe Trinque, you can answer that question, or somebody else who may, you know. This is not just about cybersecurity. This is actual spare parts for the cranes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I would have to defer to someone else on how long it would take to get replacements for those cranes.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I don't think I have a specific time frame for that particular component, but I think the larger issue here that we absolutely agree with is that we do see an over-reliance on these PRC manufactured cranes. This is not an anomaly. We see this as a concerted effort where the PRC has proven and stated its intent to be the leading manufacturer in not only cranes like this, but other types of maritime equipment. And that does introduce vulnerabilities like you're talking about, not only the cyber, but the ability to have access to the materials that are going to be necessary to maintain the smooth functioning of those that equipment in our ports.
Thank you. My time is up. Now I now yield to the ranking member from Michigan, Mr. Thanadar.
Thank you, Chairman Jimenez. Madam Assistant Secretary, thank you for your testimony. I appreciate the concerns that have been raised about foreign-made cranes. However, U.S. critical infrastructure and supply chains face a wide range of threats beyond cranes. How does DHS identify vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure and supply chains, and how does DHS take action based on relative risks?
Absolutely. I think you have made a good point in that not only the role of seaports are indispensable to national security, but broader supply chain security, resiliency and efforts are indispensable. DHS has a wide mission, as I mentioned in my opening statement, trade facilitation and enforcement, protecting our cyberspaces, critical infrastructure security, and emergency preparedness and response. And we have to execute on all of those missions across the totality of critical infrastructures. So not only seaports, transportation systems, but all the 16 sectors of critical infrastructure nodes.
Thank you. And Madam Assistant Secretary, I represent the city of Detroit. The Port of Detroit is not among the largest U.S. ports and does not have any container cranes. But it is still vital to the local economy and must be protected against cyber attacks. However, small and medium-sized ports do not always have the same resources available to large ports as they seek to invest in cybersecurity measures. What is DHS doing to ensure small and medium-sized ports are not left behind as we look to enhance cybersecurity?
Thank you so much for the question. As we had said in our earlier statements as well, national security is very much inextricably linked to the smooth functioning of ports. And that means not only the large ports, but many of the smaller ones that constitute our maritime transportation system. on a typical day, we see CBP processing, as I said, billions of tons of goods, millions of tons of goods, and processing up to $9.2 billion of imported products. So the value as well as the volume is quite significant. From a DHS perspective, we're committed to, across all sizes of businesses and critical infrastructure organizations, providing a whole host of cost-free services that enable those organizations to take cyber hygiene training, guidance, other types of services. We also are leveraging hundreds of advisors and subject matter experts drawn from all sectors and all types of businesses to make sure that they're at the table and helping inform and develop those guidelines. And then finally, DHS also provides funds to state and local and private sector, not only in the maritime critical infrastructure sectors, but across those sectors to aid in cyber preparedness, but also in prevention and testing and exercise against the whole range of hazards.
Thank you so much, Vann. I'm glad to see the administration taking bold action to enhance cybersecurity. However, some of these actions will take quite a while to show results, such as domestic manufacturing of cranes and the publication and implementation of regulations. What is the Coast Guard doing to address cybersecurity threats in the near term?
Ranking Member, you're correct. The notice of paroles rulemaking that is out there, we're going to get a lot of feedback on that so that we get that right as we move forward, which will raise the bar across the entirety of the MTS. I would say that there are existing requirements to do vulnerability assessments across the MTS and assess those threats and hazards, working across the interagency to ensure that when those vulnerabilities are identified, we reach back into the facility security officers to ensure that those vulnerabilities can be closed. And I think it's important to note that the executive order that was issued explicitly gives us the authority to control access, vessel movements, access to facilities when an identified vulnerability exists. So I think we can take immediate action today, but I think raising the bar across the board for the rulemaking process will get a more level playing field across the MTS.
Thank you. Chairman, my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Congress has a responsibility to observe carefully and evaluate the actions of our executive branch and to condemn executive actions that we believe weaken national security or injure our country. We have an equal responsibility to observe and carefully evaluate the actions of our executive branch and to commend the actions of our White House and our executive authorities when we believe they've done something right that's in support of national security and furthers the best interests of our nations. There's a rare moment when I'm going to commend the Biden administration. On February 21st this year, President Biden issued an executive order to bolster the security of our nation's ports, alongside a series of additional actions that will strengthen maritime security, fortify our supply chains, and strengthen the United States industrial base. The executive order, the authority to respond to malicious cyber activity in the nation's maritime transportation systems, and will require the Coast Guard to report cyber threats and incidents involving a vessel, port, or waterfront facility. Further, the executive order invests $20 billion into port infrastructure over the next 5 years to bring manufacturing capacity back to the United States, with an emphasis on safe and secure cranes operating at port facilities. In 2022, Chairman Jimenez introduced H.R. 6487, the Port Crane Security and Inspection Act of 2022, which would limit the operation of foreign cranes in U.S. ports. Specifically, foreign cranes are defined in that bill as those that are manufactured by companies that are subject to the control or influence of a country designated as a foreign adversary and using software or other technology that connects that crane to the port's cyber infrastructure. I was a co-sponsor of that legislation. And Mr. Chairman, that sort of effective response from Congress as our legislative branch and from the White House as our executive branch, that's what's required for our nation to respond to emerging cyber threats. So I will stand unwaveringly in the corner of the Coast Guard as it relates to your ongoing and historically quite effective actions to protect American commerce and our maritime activities and our maritime ports. The air and the sea and the land as patrolled by our Coast Guard is under increasing threat, and therefore the focus that Congress provides to the needs of the Coast Guard has evolved and are enhanced. Admiral Arguin and Admiral Vann, let me just thank you for the work the Coast Guard does. As you know, Louisiana's 3rd District, my district, produce around 60% of all the LNG exports shipped across the world. A 2022 Government Accountability Office report found that the Coast Guard has a shortage of approximately 400 Marine inspectors. This impacts the ability to properly and effectively inspect gas-carrying vessels. Admiral Arguin, can you speak to how military recruiting challenges are affecting Coast Guard readiness and how the Coast Guard plans to fill those billets, including the 400 Marine inspectors needed to conduct gas carrier exams?
Congressman, we are actively investing in our recruiting efforts to bring in not only Marine inspectors, but the entirety of the shortfall that we see, roughly 3,000 billets that are impacting our ability to deliver the effects that Congress and the American public expect.
Yes, sir. So Admiral, clearly the Coast Guard is squared away. You're doing your best to fill these slots. Can you, as we have a shortage of inspectors, could you address your statement to what are your thoughts on using risk-based approach to conduct inspections of LNG vessels, which is highly recommended by some of us?
Congressman, the Commandant's been very clear. We need to think differently about how we do our business, whether that's a resource issue or just thinking about the ability to get after ensuring compliance with existing standards or evaluating the safety of a particular vessel. A risk-based approach is something that we are certainly interested in applying based on not only resource shortfalls, but just the risk associated with those types of platforms. It gives us a different way to assess compliance and safety and security of vessels.
We are in support of risk-based inspections, and you can count on my office to be at the Coast Guard's avail, gentlemen, ma'am, as we move forward with expanding risk-based inspections to LNG vessels. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired and I yield.
Thank you, gentleman from Louisiana. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Chairman, ranking member, and I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today. Full disclosure, as a young man, teenager, I had a great deal of reverence, still do, but at one time I wanted to be in the Coast Guard, and I guess I wasn't able to cut the mustard, so I didn't make it. But I've always had an affinity for the Coast Guard, as to the other branches of the service. But so Port Newark, located in my district, is known as the birthplace of containerization. For years, goods were located bundle by bundle onto pallets, surrounded by netting, then lifted by crane out of the ships and onto the dock, and then loaded onto trucks and trains. My father, along with several other friends and family, worked at Port Newark in their younger years. In 1956, the SS Ideal X became the world's first container ship carrying 58 rectangular containers from Port Newark to Houston. In 1962, the world's first container terminal opened at the Port of Newark. These achievements revolutionized global maritime commerce and trade. Times have changed, and drastically at ports across the U.S. With automation and new technology, our ports are shipping and receiving more goods than ever. It is critical for us to create new guidelines to fortify our ports and maritime security framework and enhance our overall resilience in the face of evolving threats. Secretary Brzozowski, according to DHS, one of the functions of the newly created Supply Chain Resilience Center is to evaluate the risks to ports posed by adversarial nations, states, over reliance on untrustworthy equipment, data extraction, and unvetted access. Port Newark uses some ship-to-shore cranes manufactured by ZPMC that may potentially pose cyber threats. Are there any examples where over-reliance on ZPMC cranes has led to vulnerabilities to port security?
Thank you for the question, and thank you as well for that shout out about the history of containerization and the revolution, how it's revolutionizing the shipping industry. I think we really are and agree at such an inflection point right now. Particular to the presence of these PRC manufactured cranes and whether we've seen any specific vulnerabilities, not to my knowledge, but I think as we're taking a close look at this issue, it's because of the potential for such a risk and the known exploitation by the PRC of critical infrastructure, even domestic critical infrastructure sectors.
Yeah, I believe that there are 200 cranes that they have had, and I believe the Coast Guard has made a check of 92 of them, haven't found any problems. The SCRC plans to conduct at least 2 tabletop exercises in 2024 to test the resiliency of the critical cross-border supply chain with other U.S. federal agencies, foreign governments, and industry. One critical component of that, I believe, could be addressed with exercises and engagement and coordination with local governments. Will opportunities be presented for local governments to participate or gain knowledge so that they are well prepared in the event of an incident?
Absolutely. State local officials, as well as state and local critical infrastructure organizations are going to be a key point of any tabletop exercises, and will certainly be part of the ones that we are planning under the Supply Chain Resilience Center.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman from New Jersey. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Building domestic infrastructure capacity is critical to reducing our reliance on foreign-made machinery, safeguarding our seaports from debilitating cyber attacks, and maintaining functional equipment. Thoughtful consideration of modernization of procurement policies to benefit the utilization of domestically manufactured equipment is critical to mitigating our reliance on cranes produced by foreign actors. Due to cost, regulations surrounding procurement, and other limitations, nearly all cranes used in U.S. seaports are manufactured in China. This includes 2 of the 5 cranes at Port Tampa Bay. I appreciate the thoughtful discussion and testimony we've heard already today about this issue and how we can be working together to mitigate these threats and ensure that our ports are safeguarded. I'd like to follow up, Secretary Brzozowski, with you on this question. As members of Congress, we spoke a little bit earlier about supply chain as it relates to cranes. I'm interested in your thoughts on what we can be doing as members of Congress to work with DHS to help build domestic infrastructure capacity for.
The Department of Homeland Security is not in the position of providing a lot of the incentives to incentivize domestic production beyond our partnerships with them to make sure that they're understanding that being part of the secure and resilient supply chain is something that's going to afford them opportunities. If an adversary, we know that if an adversary is exploiting some of these systems, the port can completely shut down. That's why we're working very closely with the Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce, on some of these incentive programs. So I think full funding of those programs, communication out to your constituencies about the availability of these programs, and a amplification of the vulnerabilities that we're seeing from a security perspective would just raise the attention and promote further production of some of these capabilities.
Thank you. Admiral Arguin, one of the other things that we've heard mentioned today is the executive order that the President recently signed to empower the Coast Guard to issue directives regarding cranes manufactured in the PRC. Can you touch on what actions, how crane operators have responded and how this is affecting your operations?
So, ma'am, the Maritime Security Directive required notification of affected crane owners and operators within 48 hours. We've touched base with each one of those crane operators. They've acknowledged that that the Maritime Security Directive applies to their operations. And so we're now continuing the conversation about what needs to be done within the elements of the sensitive security information to close those vulnerabilities. If there are questions that come up about the specific details, then my colleague at Coast Guard Cyber will be able to support, or others that have technical supporting roles will be able to help them close those vulnerabilities. And then there's a window that we will have confirmation that all of those vulnerabilities have been closed within those ports.
And Admiral Vann, would you add to that response for us?
Yes, Congresswoman. As was alluded to, if it's determined that vulnerabilities do exist, as I mentioned earlier, open doors in the network on the cranes or to the cranes, the services that we provide from Coast Guard Cyber Command assess those vulnerabilities, can hunt to see whether or not there's adversarial action on the crane network, and then help the operator eradicate it. There are other sources of these types of services. Some companies have them internal to their organizations. Others can hire this kind of help, but we can validate behind someone else's actions. We actually will deploy out into the port, onto the crane network, and we're doing that now. As was mentioned, we've assessed almost half of the PRC manufactured cranes in the country already.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you to the gentlewoman from Florida. And now the chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you for convening today's hearing on port cybersecurity and for allowing me to wave on. To our witnesses, thank you for being here. In my time on the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection, I've been proud to work with our federal partners and private industry stakeholders to improve the security of our critical infrastructure. New Jersey's 8th Congressional District is home to the largest port on the East Coast, where hundreds of billions of dollars of goods move each year. The smooth and effective movement of cargo through the Port of New York and New Jersey is critical to our economy, both regionally and nationally. I'm glad to be able to participate in today's hearing as we discuss how we can continue to keep our ports safe from cyber threats. Secretary Brzozowski, in your testimony, you mentioned that the Supply Chain Resilience Center within DHS has begun building partnerships with foreign governments. Our international partners are going to be facing many of the same vulnerabilities as our own ports, including those related to ZPMZ-built cranes and the full range of cyber threats. How is DHS working with our international partners on cyber threat information sharing related to our ports and their ports?
Maybe I'll provide a broad overview, but then would defer to my Coast Guard colleagues on the actual cyber-specific information sharing. Through the Supply Chain Resilience Center, we're working with a variety of foreign nations on looking at this particular threat, comparing notes and seeing what their perspective is, and also discussing particular mitigations. We're also working to identify other countries that have models of Supply Chain Resilience Center that could afford a good template for not only what the Department of Homeland Security is doing, but how we're working with our interagency partners in transportation, commerce, and the Department of Defense. Having the center be able to work with our interagency colleagues and with the private sector is very important, but also having our center be able to connect with similar centers internationally and develop early warning systems and share information about not just cyber threats, but the movement of goods, shipping trends, logistics information, and be able to not only predict and mitigate, but also practice for and exercise our capabilities in terms of enhancing the resilience against any type of threat.
And have you identified any models or any of our international partners who are sort of perhaps ahead of where we are on identifying and addressing these challenges?
We've had great conversations with a range of international partners. One with our colleagues in Finland stands out. They've maintained a supply chain resilience center that has kept domestic production and has exercised against a range of hosts, throughout the Cold War, since World War II, they're operating on a different scale than we are. But many of the models, the frameworks, and the ideas are ones that we are finding very valuable and informative.
Appreciate that. We've talked a lot in our cybersecurity subcommittee this Congress about how to streamline reporting requirements to make sure they're effective. The Coast Guard seems well positioned to lead in this area because of the existence of the National Response Center, which is the single reporting point for physical security breaches at ports and has a mature process for passing that information to federal, state, and local agencies. For any of the witnesses that would like to take this, could the Coast Guard leverage the existing National Response Center to streamline cyber incident reporting?
Congressman, we currently use our National Response Center as the single point for reporting information related to maritime cyber incidents. There is an ongoing effort by CISA to try and harmonize that across the interagency, and we're participating in that to ensure that there's a seamless connection to federal entities that need to know about incident reporting or incidents that have happened within other segments.
Appreciate it. And sort of just to follow up on that, I want to make sure that we're preparing for that information sharing to go both ways so that our ports have access to timely, actionable intelligence about cyber threats. How does the Coast Guard share reported threat information with industry participants? And how does the Coast Guard work with partners like CISA or the MTS, ISAC to ensure effective information sharing?
Congressman, I'll take a stab at that one.
Thank you.
So we absolutely do provide from Coast Guard Cyber Command resources to include current information on threats that's available to operators in ports. Additionally, working across the interagency with CISA and others, we will produce maritime cyber alerts as timely as possible. So those are kind of as needed as threats emerge. And then we are a member of the intelligence community. So we are working with other agencies and DoD across Intel, and we have had examples of declassifying higher classification information and then making that available to port operators. And finally, you mentioned the ISAC. We absolutely cooperate, share information. They do a good job of pushing it out across all operators in the system.
Appreciate that. Yield back.
Thank you, gentleman from New Jersey. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. Thank you for allowing me to wave on this morning. Thank you to the panel for being here and for your service to this country. I represent New York's 4th District, which is Nassau County on Long Island. And I know how important the Port of New York and New Jersey is to not only New York, but our region and, of course, this country as a whole. According to a report by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, this port is the largest container port on the East Coast, moving hundreds of billions in goods each year. This is really an open question to any of you. In 2022, China was by far the #1 country of origin for goods coming into this port. Can anyone speak roughly to the size of the physical Chinese presence at both the Port of New York and New Jersey and specifically other ports on the East Coast? Not all at once.
Not specifically, no. I mean, this is very much the issue that under the new Supply Chain Security Resilience Center, we are taking a close look at to get understanding of not only the dominance in port cranes, but looking across other types of port equipments and then looking across broader infrastructures.
Okay, so I think we would agree that there is a presence. Obviously, the goods are the presence, and they have a physical presence at the ports. So are there any implications for our cybersecurity due to their large presence, not only physically and the goods in the ports of New York and New Jersey and the Northeast?
Congressman, I would just say that what we experience when we operate on critical infrastructure networks in ports, on operational technology and information technology networks, there are, I guess I would offer, there are a number of vectors by which access can be gained. It could be physical access, it could be remotely through networking and communication lines that come in from the outside, or conceivably it could be local physical presence that then either connects through a physical connection or a Wi-Fi connection to a network. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but certainly presence adds a threat vector, if that does.
So I think that it's important to realize our ports, obviously, there's so much that goes into the logistics of the ports, whether it's the physical port itself, the trucking industry, the warehousing, the cargo that's in the port. Can you just describe the implications? Because I think it's sort of hard to understand the implications of even what a short-term halt would do to a port like the Port of New York and New Jersey.
Congressman, what I would maybe try and take a sort of the view is any disruption, cyber or otherwise, a hurricane, anything that would cause a ripple in that very tightly fine-tuned system will have really diverse impacts. And so part of what each local sector commander, captain of the port is focused on each and every day with their teams is to ensure that are we looking at the right things to determine whether or not those disruptions are predictable? And if they are, what can we do to minimize that disruption downstream? There's, it's one aspect of the marine transportation system is to get the cargo to the port. There's an entire rest of that conversation that will be impacted downstream. And so we are hyper-focused on that. I know that the Supply Chain Resiliency Center is also looking at that to ensure that that disruption is minimized to the extent possible.
Right, so specific to, again, talking about responses and shutdowns at ports, and obviously, to your point, there's so much that goes into preparing and mitigating, and we always want to ask ourselves, are we better off today than we were yesterday in preparation for whatever the inevitable is? So how fast would the Coast Guard be able to respond to an incident at the port? And specific to New York and New Jersey, is it almost instant?
So we maintain a 24/7 presence in all ports, and so as soon as we are aware of the challenge, we'll decide which teams need to be involved in understanding the impact of that, and then what we need to do to minimize that disruption.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you to the gentleman from New York. Now the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for allowing me to wave on. And I appreciate the witnesses for your service, and also during this time through our own investigation here on Capitol Hill and through your efforts. I think every American should be concerned about even the possibility of the vulnerability that we see in our ports with regards to the Chinese Communist Party and their use of trade to facilitate, many different nefarious actions. So I'll start with Admiral Trinque. To the extent that you can you share what policies or plans that TRANSCOM has taken under the National Port Readiness Network that use Chinese manufactured port equipment and technology to make sure that we are secure and what those vulnerabilities are.
Congressman, thank you very much for the question. Our strategic seaports are critical to our ability to project and sustain the joint force, and so the National Port Readiness Network allows us at an interagency level to assess and remediate risks in those ports. Specific to the technology to which you refer in our strategic seaports, when we deploy out of an Army unit, for instance, out of our strategic seaports, is generally not using those cranes. It is generally using other types of vessels, other modes of transport. Additionally, in our strategic seaports that do have those cranes, there are other cranes that could be used. And so our current assessment is none of our strategic seaports right now are wholly dependent on those cranes.
Okay. I'll go to Admiral Vann. During our investigation, we learned that ZPMC manufactures many of its ship-to-shore cranes at Tianjin base, which is also very close to the Tianjin Island, which is close to where the PLAN produces a lot of its warships. Obviously there's the proximity and just knowing how many of these companies operate inside China is concerning. So, number one, are you aware that the ZPMC ship-to-shore cranes used by U.S. ports are manufactured near the PLAN shipbuilding site?
No, Congressman, I was not aware that the construction of the cranes occurs at a location close to a PLA Navy site.
Does anybody on the panel want to take a stab at this, or is this something that y'all are aware of?
Congressman, I was not aware of that. I don't know that that increases the level of risk, because I think we view the proliferation of Chinese technology in our seaports as a potential strategic risk, regardless of where in the PRC they're constructed.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to think that it wouldn't increase the risk if their proximity was either co-located or on the same island, or that they share, either some sort of trade secrets or intellectual property. I mean, there's some of these things that we don't know. So I maybe disagree with you slightly that wouldn't increase the risk, but I guess the question here is, what are we doing about those types of things, whether geographically co-located or there's a network of leadership that is tied together? What are we doing as a U.S. government to either prevent that or stop those vulnerabilities? It looks like you want to answer.
So I won't really dive into stop the manufacturer piece. That's really outside of my lane. What I would say is the executive order, specifically with respect to the Chinese manufactured cranes, required certain things to be done to close known vulnerabilities and assess those vulnerabilities to ensure that they cannot be exploited. And then our proposed rulemaking would require a vulnerability assessment across all modes, regardless of where something had been manufactured, to understand where there may be exploitable connectivity, and then requirements that would close those down. So to some extent, regardless of where you manufacture something, we would understand where there potentially doors were open, and so that we could close those doors to prevent some sort of nefarious activity.
Okay. Well, talking about the executive order, and I'll go to Ms. Brzozowski. Was this executive order in any way linked to Volt Typhoon and the malicious activity that that Microsoft, I guess, first allegedly reported on?
I actually defer to my Coast Guard colleagues on that, who are aware of all the details.
Congressman, I'm just happy to talk a little bit about that particular threat. That actor is a threat that uses a technique called living off the land. These are activities on a network that are not easily recognizable, because they get on a network and then use standard activities that occur in network traffic all the time. And so what it requires us to do as we look for adversaries is to look for behavioral patterns. So a significant amount of analysis after we look at a network. Back to the question of the EO. What the EO really does, again, is allow a captain of the port, if it's determined that there is a threat or there's been some disruption because of a cyber intrusion, to take action to maybe, in this case, in your example, to secure a crane or secure a terminal until such time that the operator, maybe with our assistance, at least with our validation, takes action to secure that particular node of the system.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I commend you for this hearing. And obviously 5 minutes is not enough to dig into all the issues, but thank you for allowing me to wave on.
Thank you, gentleman from Texas. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to represent a district that includes Port of Long Beach. It's one of the largest ports in the United States and the second largest container seaport. The Port of Long Beach is a city department in Long Beach, and when I was mayor for the last 8 years, the Harbor Department was a huge part of the work that we do in the city and, of course, across California and the West Coast. I'm also proud to co-chair the Congressional Ports Caucus, and security of our ports is incredibly important and a top priority for us and the work that we do. We know that the port's impact on the economy is critical, and of course we saw its impact when we had the supply chain crisis just not long ago. My port alone handles trade valued at over $200 billion every year, and we support 2.6 million jobs throughout the supply chain and throughout different types of trade and transportation jobs across the country. And it's great to see bipartisanship today on this issue. I will love to add that I think President Biden has been a great leader on issues around ports and security. I think the investments being made in the infrastructure bill are significant, and he's also taken reasonable and common sense steps to improve maritime security. Last week, of course, he had his executive order, which got support from both sides of the aisle as well. Chairman Jimenez and I also work together as former mayors, as co-chairs of the Peru Caucus, which is nice to say also to have bipartisan support there as well. Now, under the executive order, the U.S. Coast Guard will have the authority to respond to cyber attacks or espionage in the supply chain with new standards. We will also require reporting of cyber incidents or active cyber threats endangering vessels, harbors, ports, or other waterfront facilities. We know this is critical because we know that the maritime supply chain include many overlapping companies and actors as well. Now, our hearing today, I know, is focused on cranes, which is critical and surely has to be discussed and investigated. But we know that cyber attacks can hit anywhere in the supply chain, including at port terminals or vessel communications. Rear Admiral Vann, I'm sure you're familiar with the history of ransomware attacks, which have impacted port operations, including back home in California and around the world. Can you speak more about how President Biden's executive order will increase security at other parts of the supply chain, from terminal operators to other important communications networks?
Yes, Congressman, what the executive order does is give that local captain of the port the ability to either react to a known threat or respond to an actual attack, not just to cranes, but to all of the operational technology in the marine transportation system and business systems as they apply to impacting the operations of ports. And so in our work in the Coast Guard Cyber Command, we go about the business of assessing the vulnerabilities that exist, about notifying partners that we talked about with threat information, and then about locating malicious activity and helping port partners eradicate it. Again, the executive order gives that local captain of the port the opportunity, the ability to keep the port safe and secure while a cyber threat is addressed.
Thank you. I want to also just to add on that, Rear Admiral, the issue of the way automation is also changing our needs around being cyber secure, and certainly it's impacting not just cranes, but all other types of vehicles and equipment at our ports and harbors. Do you see that the increase in automation, which there is some concern about, and certainly from the ILW dock workers and others, does that actually increase our kind of vulnerability to cyber attacks and to some of these concerns being shared today?
Thank you, Congressman. I've kind of been waiting for this question. Absolutely. As we increase automation, while it brings efficiencies, it increases the terrain, the cyber terrain that we must protect. And the point I really want to make here is that all of us, whether it's government, private companies that are operating the ports, all need to take the vulnerabilities that are created by this increased surface, this threat surface that's now there with increased automation, need to take that very seriously, make it part of their calculus in securing the system.
I think that's absolutely right. That's one of the concerns that I share also with kind of automation that's not really gone through a real process with the workers in the community and cyber experts and what we're seeing. Just lastly, just more of a comment than anything else. So I've been to China a few times as mayor of Long Beach and met with port operators and companies there. it's important to remember that China is absolutely a competitor of the United States. They are, in it to beat us in every single way, and we want to make sure that we're always ahead. It's also critical to note that China is our single largest trading partner in the United States on the West Coast especially. And our ports all on the West Coast depend on Chinese trade. And so we must look at China both as a competitor, but also a strategic partner when it comes to commerce. West Coast ports would collapse without Chinese trade, and millions of jobs would be lost, certainly in districts like mine and others along the West Coast as well. And so we have to, I think, both balance those while continuing to push and understand the real threats that China poses to our economy and certainly to cybersecurity. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen from California. I'll be open to a second round for those who want to stick around. So there's some other questions that I want to ask. So I know you were expecting it, but here we go. All right. As you know, the testimony is being I'm listening to the testimony. My mind goes somewhere else. I don't know about cybersecurity, but my mind goes to actual physical impediments. None of you, I don't believe, have the answer to my question. What would happen if China somehow embargoed spare parts, maintenance, et cetera, of cranes? What would happen to our ability to move our commerce? Because 80% of the commerce that comes in the United States through the seas, actually somehow a Chinese crane touches it, because we have 80% of the cranes in this country are actually are Chinese manufactured. Another question that I have is, how do they get there? How were they able to achieve such dominance, and are they increasing their dominance around the world, and how can we combat that? Not sure, again, that any of you have the answer to that question, but maybe you have the answer to this question. I have recently came back from Peru and a Codel down to South America, Panama. Interesting that the canal that we built has Chinese controlled port on the Pacific side and on the Atlantic side. They're building a new port down in Peru for the Peruvians. The Peruvians are going to ask for another port down in South Peru, and hopefully we can bid on it. But something tells me somehow that the Chinese, the CCP, are going to underbid the United States. Is it possible? As a possibility. And they're also building airports and seaports around the world. Is it possible that without safeguards, that our trade can actually be disrupted across the world with the dominance of the cranes, not only the cranes, but also the ports, in a nefarious fashion, so that Chinese manufactured goods, et cetera, flow very, very smoothly, but somehow American manufactured goods and trade don't flow quite as smoothly. Is that a possibility?
I'll take that and say yes. I think it's not only a possibility, but something that we're seeing play out around the world. It's no secret that China has both the capability and the intent to challenge the rules-based trade system, and they're leveraging all instruments of their national power to do so. They're looking to gain access not only to technology and data, and in particular the vulnerabilities that we're talking about around the cranes today, but engaging in a number of other practices to undercut American workers and businesses. I mean, we're seeing an influx of production of fentanyl through American ports. If you're talking about physical ports, we're seeing a use of vile practices associated with forced labor to undercut the competitiveness of U.S. and other global companies, and bringing goods to market that are not only made in a means that are very contrary to U.S. values, but undercut, as I said, legitimate businesses that can't compete in that type of situation. And we're also seeing that we're malign economic influences coming in through investments. I spoke that DHS is part of the CFIUS committee, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and we're taking a very, very close look at investments, particularly in our critical infrastructure sectors.
I take concern with their zeal in creating and investing and actually manufacturing, creating the the infrastructure that they need in order to create ports, airports, etc., that will dominate trade around the globe. And they do this. It's really not a great value for those countries. It's a cheap price, but not a great value. And I'll explain why. They will give a cheaper price, but then they'll bring the labor from China to do the work, which in essence means that that country's capital is actually leaving and going to China. Versus what we do, usually we bring our expertise to it, but the actual workforce for that infrastructure is actually from the country, which means more of that money is actually invested in the country. So this Belt and Roads Initiative causes me great concern. It's not just about the cranes, it's about the entire, and they do it in a very holistic fashion, and they're very committed to that. So, you know, I share great concerns about that. And so I'll yield now to the ranking member from Michigan, Mr. Vann.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, congressional leaders announced a plan to address government funding for the remainder of the fiscal year. I'm hopeful that we can avoid a costly and unnecessary government shutdown. But given how elusive a funding agreement has been, I'm not making any assumptions until a bill is passed and signed by the President. The last government shutdown in 2019 had a dramatic and lasting impact on the Coast Guard, among other agencies, and a shutdown now would have a similar effect. I want to ask each one of you, any one of you, how would a government shutdown affect your agency's workforce and mission in general, and port security in particular?
Ranking Member, the uncertainty associated with a government shutdown or continuing resolutions certainly has an impact on our ability to continue to purchase and bring to bear new technologies that are going to be important in protecting the nation's ports. It also has a negative impact on our ability to recruit and retain. We talked earlier about the challenges that we're currently having to bring in new talent, the talent that's necessary to deliver on the services that you and the American public expect. You mentioned 2019, 35-day shutdown where the Coast Guard was not getting paid. That is still having reverberating effects on our existing workforce, on our ability to retain individuals. And so that will not help us bring in that talent that we need.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yes, thank you for the question. I'll say without equivocation that any lapse in federal funding disrupts the vital work of the department and will leave Americans less safe as a result. 3 out of 4 DHS employees would be required to work without pay should there be a shutdown. This includes enforcement officers at the borders, analysts, investigators, and of course the men and women of the U.S. Coast Guard.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Admiral Arguin, last week the Coast Guard issued a notice of proposed rulemaking to enhance cybersecurity by requiring port owners and operators to implement a wide range of measures. This proposal builds upon a series of security directives TSA has issued for various modes of transportation over the past few years, and it represents a change from the voluntary approach the Coast Guard has previously taken in issuing cybersecurity guidelines. Why did the Coast Guard decide to initiate the rule-making process rather than continuing to rely on voluntary standards?
Ranking Member, I think the entirety of this hearing has kind of highlighted the increasing vulnerabilities, the increasing connectedness of systems within the marine transportation system, and those vulnerabilities and its long-term consequences of not doing something, requiring vessels and facilities that operate in that system to have an elevated standard. We're very much interested in getting feedback on whether or not that standard is going to be effective, but but we also recognize that whatever standard gets put in place is going to have to regularly evolve given the emerging threats.
Thank you. And how did the Coast Guard coordinate with TSA in developing the proposed rulemaking? How do the Coast Guard's requirements mirror those issued by TSA, and how do they differ?
Ranking member, so every 2 weeks we have a cybersecurity interdepartment conversation about where each of the interagency rulemakings are in the process. So we were looking to harmonize that just within the department. And then we also participate with CISA's Cyber Incident Reporting Council to ensure that we have got harmonization within the department. But there have been regular conversations about where certain things are required. I mean, in fairness, cybersecurity is not inherently special to the maritime. Those same systems and vulnerabilities exist across all modes, all sectors. And so we want to make sure that those same vulnerabilities are being closed across each of those sectors. And so that work will continue.
Thank you. And Chair, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. Mr. Payne, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member. Last week, the Biden administration announced billions in funding to support domestic crane manufacturing to strengthen our critical infrastructure resilience at ports across the country. And I am very happy to see the president's effort in bringing a lot of this manufacturing back home. We passed the CHIPS Act to make sure that we have the chips that we need and don't have to rely on foreign adversaries. And also it's good to see that they're bringing back the crane composition. We need to manufacture here at home. And the Biden administration has taken many steps in order to secure the equipment that we need at home and not rely on foreign actors. Assistant Brzozowski, as the administration makes these needed investments, how will the SCRC ensure opportunities are made available to local business, particularly minority-owned operated businesses, to serve as contractors or subcontractors?
Thank you very much for the question. The Supply Chain Resilience Center is working across the interagency to identify the areas where, from a security perspective and a resilience perspective, we'd like to see domestic production increase. We work very closely with the other agencies that are going to be responsible for administering those funds that go out to incentivize some of that return of production. That includes departments of transportation and commerce. Of course, as we would love to see and very much believe that local businesses, local critical infrastructure operators will be a key part of bringing some of those production capabilities back under some of these incentive programs.
Thank you. Rear Admiral Arguin, considering that the Port of Newark is a crucial hub that drives economic activity both locally and nationally, and I ensure it remains that way, how will the Coast Guard work with ports to ensure that they have full understanding of the required cybersecurity measures and to check for compliance?
Congressman, so Captain Zeta Merchant, who's the current sector commander, captain of the port, regularly engages with industry stakeholders within her operational area, and her staffs have been engaging with not only the facilities that have cranes that could be considered underneath this executive order, but across the board, any system, or any one of those facilities that has a potential vulnerability that could disrupt the flow of commerce within the Port of New York, New Jersey, she is hyper-focused on.
Excellent. Are there grant funding that's available for ports as they work to enhance cybersecurity?
Yes, sir. Each year, FEMA FEMA puts on port security grant programs. The local sectors, captains of the port, support bringing in industry stakeholders, evaluating those proposals against potential buy-down to risk, and then we provide those recommendations to FEMA for a decision on whether or not those particular grants would be supported.
Well, thank you for that, and I thank you for your answers from all the panel. Thank you for your service to this country, and with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, gentleman from New Jersey. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you. Just to circle back, I'm trying to remember. If someone knows the company that actually produces most of the Chinese cranes is CPMC, I believe, if that's correct. And maybe this was discussed earlier. So, interestingly enough, I've been to the ZPMC factory in China when I was mayor, and especially because so much of our economy was port related and working, they obviously have a huge American presence as well, and are very present in the Long Beach, Los Angeles area. And of course, their operations are immense and incredibly impressive. And so I just want to add to what my colleague was saying is the one thing that I took away from that experience was how lacking our ability to produce this level of infrastructure is in the United States. We have nothing near ZPMC's kind of output because they're producing globally. And my concern would also be is that this is not only a national security issue for the United States, where we import numerous ZPMC cranes, but it's a national security issue across the world, where every port that they're building or every crane that's going to another port, the Chinese do have influence or the ability to possibly have disruptions there. And so I just want to add that anything that we can do as a committee or as members to assist in encouraging the production of cranes and port manufacturing here in the United States is something that we must do. And I'm not sure if there's a comment on that from anyone.
I'm going to jump on that because I would love a second bite at the apple of a prior question about what Congress could do. Of course, as we stand up the Supply Chain Resilience Center, we're pulling from existing resources within the department. We'd love to work with Congress to fully fund that effort and ensure that we've got the capabilities, as do our other departments that we'll be coordinating with, to deep dive, have that analytical visibility, the research capabilities, and to be able to really create an agile and responsive capability in service of ensuring supply chain resilience.
Thank you. And then I have one question that's unrelated. It's about the Conception Fire, and I want to touch on this topic. In Southern California, the Conception Fire, obviously, for those that don't know, was a dive boat that caught fire, sank off the Santa Cruz Island off the coast. 33 passengers and 1 crew member were killed when a fire broke out below decks. Worst maritime disaster in California in over 150 years. We obviously want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. The NTSB's report on the accident concluded they had a safety management system. They concluded that had a safety management system been in place, the owner-operator of Conception could have identified unsafe practices and fire risks on the boat and taken corrective action before the catastrophe and loss of life occurred. We know that the Coast Guard obviously is involved in looking at this. The Coast Guard, since 2021, we believe has not really been producing as quickly as we would like to see the information. This was three years ago. Last year I asked about making progress on the rulemaking and was told, quote, the Coast Guard is actively working on the notice of proposed rulemaking for the safety management systems on passenger vessel rulemaking, unquote. Admiral Arguin, it's almost been a year since then. I can best tell there's been no real progress made, and maybe there has been. I know this falls under your command for prevention policy, so I'm just wondering when the Coast Guard will issue a proposed rule for safety management systems for passenger and small passenger vessels.
Congressman, so the process to evaluate comments and to generate a rule is complex and can take a while, especially when you get a number of comments that you need to adjudicate. We're continuing to work through those. But I would say that we have implemented a number of other measures since the Conception Fire that have reduced risk for those particular types of platforms. And so we're actively working to get that safety management system rulemaking finalized. And but I think writ large across the board, the small passenger fleet is a safer fleet today.
And I know that we hear, the conception families, of course, there's just a lot of hurt and interest in getting that resolved. The NPRM says possibly later this year we'll get some type of report or additional implementation. Do you think that date is going to stick, Admiral?
Sir, I'm not a betting man. I would say that the challenges of getting a rulemaking are not something that we're slowed down by, but we're continuing to press forward to try and get a rulemaking on the street as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate that.
Thank you, gentlemen from California. Mr. Garcia, let me say that the importance to restore heavy manufacturing back to the United States, that's critical to our national security, is something that both sides fully are in agreement with. We don't agree on too many things, but on that we do. And so, again, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.